There are many heresies in Vatican II. This video will focus on one that's very widespread and quite visible in the Vatican II sect. As our material proves, the Vatican II sect is not the Catholic Church, but the prophesied end times counter-church. In number 8 of Vatican II's decree on ecumenism, we read, quote, "In certain special circumstances, such as the prescribed prayers for unity, and during ecumenical meetings, it is allowable, indeed even desirable, that Catholics should join in prayer with their separated brethren," end quote. This passage of Vatican II endorses so-called ecumenical meetings with heretics and schismatics, such as with Protestants and the Eastern Orthodox, and it approves joint prayer with them at such meetings. This is directly contrary to what the Catholic Church has always taught, as we will see. This teaching of Vatican II is evil and heretical. In his 1928 encyclical Mortalium Animos, Pope Pius XI condemned so-called interreligious meetings and stated that the opinion on which they are based is tantamount to apostasy. In that encyclical he also taught, quote, "So, venerable brethren, it is clear why this apostolic see has never allowed its subjects to take part in the meetings of non-Catholics," end quote. As we can see, the Catholic Church has never allowed Catholics to take part in the meetings or assemblies of non-Catholics. To actively assist or take part in non-Catholic worship is a mortal sin and a violation of the divine law. This divine law principle was also repeated in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Canon 1258.1 states, "It is not licit for the faithful to actively assist in or take a part in the religious rites of non-Catholics in any manner whatsoever," end quote. It's important to understand why this activity is forbidden and what constitutes active participation in the religious rites of non-Catholics. A primary reason that many do not clearly see what the post-Vatican II crisis represents and what its false leaders are, that is, heretical antipopes, is that they lack a pure faith and a foundational understanding of the relevant Catholic principles. Before we proceed, it should be noted that this video is about active participation in non-Catholic worship or joining oneself to non-Catholic prayer or worship, which has always been forbidden. In this video, we are not addressing mixed marriages, which were discouraged but tolerated on occasion, or receiving a sacrament from a non-Catholic in danger of death, and similar things. Those kinds of communication did not constitute active participation in non-Catholic worship, which is never allowed. So don't be deceived by dishonest defenders of Vatican II who sometimes confuse people by bringing up the previous kinds of communication with non-Catholics, which were at times permitted in church history, as if they provided a precedent or a justification for the Vatican II sect's false teaching on active participation in non-Catholic worship, when they don't at all. To briefly cover the relevant principles on this matter, I want to quote from a pre-Vatican II dissertation by canonist Father Ignatius Sal. It was published in 1948 by the Catholic University of America Press and with an imprimatur. We don't agree with everything he says in the book, but he makes many good points and brings up relevant facts in articulating the Catholic Church's perennial teaching that it's forbidden to take part in any way in non-Catholic worship. In the following passages, he's primarily addressing communicatio in sacris, that is, communication in sacred things, with schismatics, such as with the Oriental dissidents or the Eastern Orthodox. But what he says applies to Protestants, Jews, Muslims, etc. Quote, "Active religious participation with schismatics is always intrinsically illicit. The reasons for this absolute prohibition of Canon 1258.1 have their origin in the natural and positive divine law. These reasons are 1. The Church is the only de jure existing true religious society in which it is licit to render to God the worship that is due him. 2. The giving of scandal through one's quasi-approval of a false sect must be avoided. And 3. The danger of perversion from the true faith must remain effectively neutralized. In consequence of the first reason, it is illicit to assist actively or to take part in all forms of worship exercised by non-Catholics. The acts of religious worship performed by schismatic sects are acts of superstitious worship and hence are illicit. This follows from the nature of superstition, which denotes either the worship of a false deity or the unlawful worship of the true deity. The ministers are unauthorized to perform sacred rites. All types of active religious communication with non-Catholics are gravely illicit. Just as one would be forbidden to profess openly his belief in a false sect, so also he is forbidden to place actions which have a religious signification and which are employed in the sacred religious functions of a false sect." End quote. As we can see, various reasons render active assistance in non-Catholic worship gravely illicit. Such active religious communication is contrary to the divine law and tantamount to a false profession of faith, for it joins one to superstitious or illicit worship. It gives the false impression that the non-Catholic is approved in conducting illicit or false worship, and it almost always involves the additional sin of scandal. With these points in mind, an attentive person should immediately recognize what this means for the Vatican II sect and its rampant false ecumenism. To illustrate how serious this is, according to Canon 2316 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, to engage in just one such act of active participation with heretics, or to knowingly help the propagation of heresy, makes one formally suspect of heresy. And if that person ignored warnings, within 6 months he would be considered a heretic. But a person doesn't have to receive or ignore canonical warnings to become a notorious heretic on this or other points. If a person repeatedly engages in non-Catholic worship against Catholic teaching and endorses such activity by repeated actions and/or his public teaching, as the Vatican II sect's representatives do, that person is a notorious heretic, notorious in fact. The Catholic Church's law on this matter concerns public acts of non-Catholic worship, and that is what we are discussing in this video. Let's give a few specific examples of what constitutes active participation in non-Catholic worship. When non-Catholics conduct public prayer or worship, some of the following things constitute condemned active participation: joining in prayers with them, blessing them or giving joint blessings with them, responding to their prayers, singing with them or singing alternately with them, giving them items such as candles, etc. that they use for worship, or receiving similar objects from them, playing the organ or a musical instrument for their worship, participating in their scripture readings, carrying icons to their worship or place of worship, burning lamps during their worship or place of worship, and many similar things. All of these things have been condemned by the Church. There are so many responses from Roman congregations forbidding all such activities that if one were to cite them all, this video would become very long. I will simply quote a few passages from Father Ignatius Sal about a few of these statements so that people get a feel for how active participation in non-Catholic prayers or worship was condemned. Quote, "In the Acts of the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith of 1769 is also found an exhortation which called upon the bishops to prohibit their priests and the faithful from communicating with schismatics in their prayers. The exhortation stated that this prohibition had been decreed by all the sacred councils. According to the Holy Office statement of August 7, 1704, it was forbidden for Catholics to be present at the masses and official public prayers of schismatics, even when the prayers contained nothing that was contrary to the faith or opposed to the Catholic rite. On December 5, 1668, the Holy Office instructed the Bishop of Trebinia to order the Catholics subject to him not to go to Mass or to other divine offices in the churches of schismatics, and to warn them that they were not bound by the precept of hearing Mass when there was no celebration of a Catholic Mass. According to a Holy Office response dated January 13, 1818, entering the churches of heretics became evil, quote, 1. If one entered with the intention of assisting at heretical rites, 2. If one's entry actually implied or even seemingly involved a communicatio in divinis with heretics, and hence offered an occasion of scandal." End quote. There were many other statements that prohibited any kind of activity that involved or signified a participation in non-Catholic worship. Various statements specifically from popes can also be cited, such as Pope Pius IX Neminem Vestrum, quote, "The regulations and decrees which the popes and the sacred congregations published or would publish, especially those which prohibit communicatio in divinis, communication in divine things, with schismatics." End quote. Also, concerning the, quote, "Old Catholics who were heretics and schismatics who rejected Vatican I's dogmatic definition of papal infallibility, Pope Pius IX stated, "They, the faithful, should totally shun their religious celebrations, their buildings." Pope Pius VI, in his encyclical Caritas in 1791, speaking of priests who had separated from the Church by accepting the heretical civil constitution of the clergy in France, stated, "Above all, avoid and condemn the sacrilegious intruders. Do not hold communion with them, especially in divine worship." End quote. In his 1880 encyclical Arcanum, Pope Leo XIII also warned about the forbidden association and communication in religious matters with non-Catholics. Now, the passage from Vatican II which we cited approves active participation in non-Catholic worship, which the Catholic Church totally condemns, as we've seen, because the passage is about joining in prayers with non-Catholics during so-called ecumenical meetings, at which non-Catholics conduct public prayer and worship according to their non-Catholic rites and sects. Thus, Vatican II's teaching is indefensible, evil, and heretical. It laid the foundation for the serial false ecumenism that is embraced, taught, and exemplified by the Vatican II antipopes and in, quote, dioceses all over the world. In short, the points we are covering prove that Vatican II's false ecumenism is notorious heresy, and anyone who defends it is a heretic and a false teacher who leads people into mortal sin. Vatican II's false teaching on joint prayer and worship with non-Catholics was endorsed by many subsequent statements of the antipopes, including Antipope John Paul II's New Catechism, paragraph 1399, his first encyclical Redemptor Hominis No. 6, his encyclical Ut Unum Sint No. 21 and following, the Directory for the Application of Principles and Norms on Ecumenism, and much more. In Ut Unum Sint, Antipope John Paul II goes on and on recommending and teaching the very thing that the Catholic Church has always condemned, namely joint worship with non-Catholics. The Directory for the Application of Principles and Norms on Ecumenism, promulgated in 1993 by John Paul II and the Council for Promoting Christian Unity, is one of the most astounding documents that the Vatican II Counterchurch has produced. It's essentially a manual for how to commit sins against the faith. It explicitly recommends the very actions that were specifically condemned by the Church. In number 118, the Directory says that Catholics who attend non-Catholic churches are encouraged to take part in the psalms, responses, hymns, and common actions of the Church in which they are guests. As we've seen, this is condemned by Catholic teaching. In number 50C, it encourages Catholic religious to organize meetings among Protestants of various churches for liturgical prayer, for recollection, and spiritual exercises. This is condemned by Catholic teaching. There are many other things we could cite, including how the Directory discourages Catholics from proselytizing non-Catholics. Concerning this notoriously heretical Directory of Sin, Antipope John Paul II stated in Ut Unum Sint, "The Directory for the Application of Principles and Norms on Ecumenism, issued with my approval by the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity." This heretical Directory on Ecumenism, approved by Antipope John Paul II and the Council for Promoting Christian Unity, also makes it clear that it is implementing the teaching and principles of Vatican II. It's also interesting that when in Mortali Manimos, Pope Pius XI says that the Apostolic See has never allowed its subjects to take part in the meetings of non-Catholics, he uses the Latin word conventibus, which means meetings, assemblies, or gatherings. Well, in directly contradicting Pius XI's teaching, Vatican II uses the exact same word, conventibus, when it approved and recommended joint prayer at such meetings. There are so many examples, perhaps thousands, of the Vatican II sect's antipopes and its apostate so-called bishops and priests engaging in false ecumenism and condemned active participation in non-Catholic worship that it would take far too long to cover even a significant portion of them in this video. It's a regular occurrence in the Vatican II Counterchurch. We have documented many of these incidents in our book, videos, and articles over the years. However, I want to focus on just a few examples from Antipope John Paul II, Antipope Benedict XVI, and Antipope Francis. You will find much more on each of the antipopes in our material. In 1982, Antipope John Paul II took part in a joint service with the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury in Canterbury Cathedral. He and the notoriously heretical Anglican prayed together, prayed at the altar together, and even gave a, quote, joint blessing. That is a public mortal sin and an expression of heresy. In 1999, John Paul II went to Romania and took active part in the, quote, Orthodox liturgy with Teoctist. That is a mortal sin and an expression of heresy. He met with Teoctist on various occasions and signed a joint declaration with him. In 1999, Teoctist also revealed that John Paul II gave him a donation for the construction of a cathedral, which turned out to be $100,000. In 2018, Francis did something similar, contributing 100,000 euros toward the first Orthodox monastery in Austria. Interestingly, on January 29, 1828, the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith declared it illicit to give alms for a schismatic church. In 1983, John Paul II went to a Lutheran church to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the birth of the heretic Martin Luther. While there, he and the Lutheran, quote, pastor prayed together before the altar, quote, blessed the congregation simultaneously, and together intoned a creed. That is a public mortal sin and an expression of heresy. We could go on and on with other examples of John Paul II's active participation in non-Catholic worship with regard to heretics and schismatics, but he did it with pagans, Jews, and Muslims as well. On April 13, 1986, John Paul II went to the Roman synagogue, took active part in the Jewish ceremony, and bowed his head as the Jews prayed for the coming of their, quote, Messiah. That's an act of apostasy. Interestingly, St. Thomas Aquinas said that if anyone were to worship at the tomb of Muhammad, he would be deemed an apostate. That's because to participate in non-Catholic forms of worship is tantamount to a profession of faith in those false religions, as we've covered. John Paul II and various Vatican II antipopes regularly committed acts of apostasy of this kind. Remember, heresy and apostasy can be manifested by deed as well as by word. John Paul II would frequently receive, quote, blessings from pagans. On August 8, 1985, John Paul II prayed with African animists, witch doctors. That's apostasy. In Africa on February 4, 1993, Channing girls treated John Paul II to a trance-inducing voodoo dance. John Paul II also organized the Assisi events and took active part in them. By organizing the Assisi events and by his active participation in them, John Paul II actually joined himself to the false worship of all the different religions at Assisi. It was a public mortal sin of the highest order and an expression of apostasy. John Paul II's career was characterized by indifferentism and participation in false forms of worship. Of course, such a public heretic and a public mortal sinner could not be a Catholic pope, let alone a saint. That's one reason that the veneration of his image, by means of his invalid and false canonization, is mentioned in the Apocalypse, as our material covers. When deceived members of the Vatican II counterchurch accept the notoriously wicked apostate anti-Pope John Paul II as a saint, a man whose career was characterized by indifferentism, public mortal sins against the faith, and participation in false religious worship, they become implicated in his sins. Online commentators and others who consider John Paul II to be a saint are clueless, deceived, and on the road to hell.
Pope St. John Paul II.
Pope St. John Paul the Great.
St. John Paul.
St. John Paul.
I'm not questioning his personal holiness.
St. John Paul II.
St. John Paul II.
Of course, St. John Paul II.
It's a term given to these teachings of St. John Paul the Great.
Two of the great saints of our times are St. Padre Pio and St. John Paul II.
Pope St. John Paul II.
We could cover much more from anti-Pope John Paul II, but let's move on to Benedict XVI. Benedict XVI frequently took part in non-Catholic worship. On August 19, 2005, he took active part in a Jewish service in a synagogue in Cologne, Germany. He joined the Jews in the Kaddish prayer and made many gestures which displayed his active participation. That is apostasy. On November 30, 2006, Benedict XVI prayed like Muslims toward Mecca in the Blue Mosque in Turkey. He even crossed his arms in the Muslim prayer gesture called the gesture of tranquility. That is apostasy. On September 23, 2011, Benedict XVI visited a Lutheran church in Erfurt, Germany. While there, he praised Martin Luther and took active part in a Lutheran service. He jointly, quote, blessed the people with the Lutheran, quote, pastor, and even prayed with a female Lutheran, quote, bishop. He bowed at the Lutheran altar. That is a public mortal sin and an expression of notorious heresy. On September 17, 2010, Benedict XVI took part in an Anglican service in Westminster Abbey with the pro-homosexual Anglican, quote, Archbishop Rowan Williams. They processed into the Protestant church together. They prayed together, and they gave a joint, quote, blessing. That is a manifestation of a false religion. Benedict XVI held his own abominable Assisi event in 2011. He not only took active part in that event of apostasy, but as the host and organizer he thereby joined himself to the false worship of all the pagans, heretics, etc., who conducted false worship at that event. We could give many other examples of Benedict XVI's mortally sinful participation in false worship. It's not only something he did often, it's something he explicitly approved with his words. On January 18, 2008, in an address to a Finnish ecumenical delegation, Benedict XVI praised joint prayer between Lutherans and, quote, Catholics, and stated that this is the royal door of ecumenism. So the activity that the Catholic Church has always condemned as gravely sinful, Benedict XVI says is the path to follow. He is a notorious heretic. False traditionalists who think that the notorious heretic Benedict XVI was conservative or is the true pope are very deceived. He was an apostate anti-pope. For more on him, see our video, The Heresies of Benedict XVI, and our articles on his heresies, based on research of 30 of his books and all of his speeches. The apostate anti-Pope Francis frequently participates in false non-Catholic worship. On November 29, 2014, Francis prayed alongside the Mufti in Istanbul's Blue Mosque. That is apostasy. On January 17, 2016, he went to the synagogue in Rome, took active part in the Jewish service, uttered various heretical things, and said, "Let us pray together to the Lord." That is apostasy. We could give many other examples of anti-Pope Francis participating in the false worship of pagans, Jews, Protestants, and the schismatic, quote, Orthodox. In addition to his actions, Francis praises joint prayer with non-Catholics, and he has explicitly mentioned in an approving way interreligious prayer. His position on this matter, which contradicts what the Catholic Church teaches, is proven to be heretical by his words and by his deeds. The fact that the Vatican II antipopes repeatedly engage in this behavior and teach that it is good proves without any doubt that they are notorious heretics. This sinful activity is also engaged in by many apostate, quote, bishops of the Vatican II sect. Simply put, false ecumenism is a giant heresy that is tantamount to denying the dogma that the Catholic Church is the one true Church of Jesus Christ, which is necessary for salvation, and that non-Catholic religions are false and sinful and lead to damnation. This heresy that it's good to participate in non-Catholic worship was taught directly in Vatican II, as we've proven in this video. It should also be noted that the divinely revealed truth that is denied by Vatican II's teaching on joint prayer and worship with non-Catholics is found in 2 John 1:10-11, which states, quote, "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into the house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works," end quote. This passage was cited by the Church in the context of condemning any participation in non-Catholic meetings or assemblies. Hence, Vatican II's evil teaching is, properly speaking, heretical. It denies the divinely revealed truth of 2 John 1:10-11. It teaches, contrary to Scripture, that it's good and desirable to take part in the wicked works and illicit or false worship of heretics and schismatics. Since the false ecumenism of the Vatican II sect comes from Vatican II, as we've shown, anyone who obstinately defends Vatican II is a spiritual fornicator and a heretic. All of the non-sedevacantist groups under the Vatican II antipopes, such as the Fraternity of St. Peter, are composed of phonies. If they actually possessed and stood for the Catholic faith, they would reject this mortally sinful heresy and the heretical antipopes who promote it. They have no love for God. In the face of these facts, some faithless people who claim to be Catholic will say, if I accepted this, I'd have to reject Catholicism. No, you are wrong, and you don't have any faith. The Catholic Church is the one true church, and this entire situation in Rome was prophesied. The men who ushered in this apostasy were heretical antipopes according to Catholic teaching. They never validly assumed the papal office, as our material proves, because a heretic is barred by divine law from becoming pope. What these facts prove is that the Vatican II sect is not the Catholic Church, and that its leaders have been antipopes. The Vatican II sect is indeed the prophesied whore of Babylon. It fulfills prophecy about the whore of Babylon and the beast in many specific ways. See our video Apocalypse Now in the Vatican. The false ecumenism that we've exposed in this video is one reason that the whore of Babylon is called the mother of the fornications. False ecumenism is the means by which people are implicated in sins against the faith as part of the end times deception. Even if you don't engage in false ecumenism directly, if you accept the Vatican II antipopes and their false canonizations, you are implicated in it. The true Catholic Church still exists in a faithful remnant, and to be a true Catholic and save your soul, you need to be a traditional Catholic who rejects the apostate Vatican II sect and the false Second Vatican Council.